Hi, this is Dave Litton, and welcome back to part 2 of the project management plan. In this session, we're going to look at the approach you need to planning in order to create the project management plan itself. So let's start off with what's known as the project scope definition. Now, the word scope is quite an important phrase you need to understand. It's what's included and what isn't. And one of the biggest dangers with projects is that when we get to the end of the project, the customers and users have a different expectation of what they were going to get. So it's important before we get anywhere near producing a plan, we need to understand what the project scope is. The first step is actually to produce an outline project business case and later refine it. Now, the business case will actually contain what the expected benefits are of the project. Remember, the project produces deliverables, or another word for that is products. A deliverable is anything the project delivers, a product is anything the project produces. So they're both the same thing. However, a product on its own isn't of any use. It's only of any use if this product, over a period of time, will realize benefits to the organization and hence the business. So the business case will contain the benefits expected, what risks there are. Remember, a business case is like a set of scales. We need to look at benefits on one side and balance that against, amongst other things, costs and risks. The project and operational timescales and costs. We would actually extract this information from the project management plan. The reason why this is important is that knowing how long the project will take to deliver will determine the earliest possible time, usually, when benefits can be realized and hence some return on the investment. And the budget needed to fund the project is also important, as well as costs in the operational life. So some of these will come from the project plan and some of these will come from the operational part of the organization. However, they need to be built into the business case, and normally some form of investment appraisal will be carried out. Don't worry if you're not familiar with this term. It's normally just a financial metric to ensure that the business case represents value for money. So we'll start off with an outline business case, and that'll be refined as the project goes through its phases, and from this we'll produce the project plan. After all, the project plan states how and when and who and what have you you're going to do to realize ultimately the benefits in the business case. But normally projects are split down into stages or phases, and in which case you may have several phases or stages, and you would take the project plan and break it down into stage plan levels. When you give out work to the specialist or technical teams, depending on the nature of the project, then they may well optionally have their own team level plan. The purpose of this slide is merely to show you that in a typical project, apart from the very smallest, you may have different levels of plans for different purposes. As part of determining what the scope of a project is, you would normally, as part of planning, produce some form of breakdown structures. Now, there's many of them, but the most obvious that you've probably come across might look something like this. And I've just come up with an example here of designing a website. So this will be the ultimate end product, if you will, the website itself, and you would split it down into product parts or deliverable parts. So these are the things that all need to be done as part of marketing. These are all the images that need to be created, and here's the sales page and text on the website. So this is a high level, and we'd split this down further to the packages of work, the activities, if you will, to create all of the products that are needed as part of the sales page. And it's called a breakdown structure because it's a hierarchy, and the human brain quite likes the way that this is created. You'll find that if you put your team in a room, perhaps using post-it notes, you can generate this type of layout quite quickly. The other thing you might want to do is to do a similar breakdown structure in terms of the organization. This might be Department A, Department B, this might be a third party, and so on and so forth. It's a nice way of getting clear in the planning meeting exactly who needs to be involved. The other type of view which would be useful is taking each of these activities and thinking about producing costs. You might do it by cost center, or again you might do it by marketing costs, graphic costs and sales page costs. The beauty of this is that as you add each lower level up, It shows you what the next level is and so on, and you can determine the budget for the whole of the project. So early on in planning, having scoped it, and as part of understanding exactly what the scope is, you would want to use some form of breakdown structures. Soon after that, you would want to think about the activities and put them in some form of sequence. The correct name for this is a network diagram. Folks in America might often call this a precedence diagram. Sometimes people mistakenly call it a PERT chart. That's not quite right, but you may come across that term. And don't worry too much about this here. These are merely activities with the arrows showing the sequence in which they need to be created. You can see that some of the activities occur after each other, and others can happen in parallel. Again, this will be brainstormed in your planning meeting. The purpose here is if you determine each duration of each activity, you can do something called critical path analysis, and you can end up with the end date. In other words, this is the earliest point when your project could be finished based on the activities and their duration and their relationships and dependencies. Another way of representing this is via what's known as a Gantt chart, and you may hear the term scheduling. This could equally apply to the previous slide. And a Gantt chart shows the activities, and I've just done them as a very simple sequence here, one after the other, where the duration of each activity is shown against a bar against a time frame. So this might be calibrated in weeks, months, and so on and so forth. And here again would be the end date. Now if you looked at a real one of these in detail, you'd find little links like this showing logical dependencies. Unlike this simple diagram here, you would normally find that each task or activity would have link lines showing the logical dependencies. Much like the previous diagram showed you the arrows here and how each of the activities relate to each other. However, the next thing to consider is, having thought about the activities, what about resources? It's one thing having a load of tasks and you know when each should start and finish, but it's another thing altogether about getting the work done. Now, the normal way of carrying out resource management, and you may have to negotiate with a resource manager, it's unlikely that you would own the people themselves, and you need to identify what resources are required and assign them in some way to your activities. You need to make sure the resources are appropriate for the tasks or activities. What this means is that if they're human, do they have sufficient knowledge, skills and experience? In the real world, of course, we don't always have everything that we want, and we need to consider resource constraints. You may well find that your plan shows you need, let's say, 3 engineers in week 10. Speaking to the resource manager, you may not find you've got that many available, or indeed you may not have that many working in your organisation, and you may have to go and hire them or adjust your time frame to make do with the amount of resources you could actually get. Now, as I touched on just now, resources come in a variety of different forms. We've talked about people, of course, like you and I, but there may be materials that you need. Materials normally get consumed in carrying out a task or activity. You may need special equipment or facilities such as setup bays, training rooms and so on. And you'll certainly need money, of course. That's the budget of the project. Accommodation is another type of resource you may need depending on the nature of the project. Machinery or special services or goods that you need to purchase. Any special tools needed in carrying out the activities and so on. So I hope this slide is opening your mind to it's not just people you need, but a variety of other resources that all need to be assigned and appointed to particular activities, so that the plan is realistic, both in terms of time frame, but also in terms of the resources required. So that when management sign off the project management plan, it's got everything in it needed to make the project a success. Just going back to that little cartoon, if you will, of a Gantt chart showing these activities, you can imagine that, let's say this is 1 week in duration, and if I was working on that, you might find that my internal labour rate might cost you, let's say, £1,000, in which case after 1 week the project will have spent £1,000. So if you now plot this on a cumulative cost graph, let's imagine this is 1 week here, you can look up here and see that this would be £1,000 on this vertical scale. If you continued, you'd have what's known as an S-curve, Although this doesn't look much like an S, traditionally projects start off and spend little at the beginning of the project. When you get into design, development and testing, the costs ramp up quite a lot because there's lots of people doing lots of work, and then they tail off towards the end. So it would look like a very shallow S. And here, of course, this is helpful in you managing and monitoring the project, because if this was today's date here, let's imagine, you could follow the planned spend and look across and say, by this period of time, we should have spent this much money. And if it's different to what the plan says, then you need to take some corrective action. Again, can I remind you that going back to breakdown structures, do you remember we looked at cost breakdown structures? Here's a simple example showing again how you might split a project up into labour, materials, equipment and overheads. This giving you the total budget. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the second step. Thank you again for your company. Tell me, do you want to bring your projects in on time and budget every single time? Then if you do, you need to check out my project management primer. As you're already on my site, go to my main front page, www.project-management-primer.com, and find out how you can swiftly become a competent project manager.